Well, let's talk about the other I word. You mentioned that like probably 10 times already in this. It's inflation. So are we going to continue? Are we going to see it level up? Because obviously raising the interest rates, that was to kind of stave off inflation. That was kind of why they did it in a number of reasons. So what are you seeing? What are you seeing with inflation going into the new year?
Yeah, so most of the data I watch suggests that we're going to see inflation decelerate, but not necessarily go back down toward the long run goal of the Federal Reserve, which is somewhere between 2% and 2.5%. And I'll come back to why that's important in a second.
Okay.
We do expect in 2023 and 2024 for inflation as the positive change in general prices of goods and services to start to go down to a lower level, but not necessarily, stop moving. So that's something else that people have to understand is that inflation generally is positive, and we like positive inflation because that means there's growth on the demand side of the economy that's sort of pulling, if you want to put it this way, prices behind it.
Yeah.
The problem with the current situation, and this has been something that's baffled economists around the world, is how much of the inflation is explained by the demand side of the economy versus the supply side of the economy. So we train and we think about policy as affecting the demand side of the economy, and that most inflations are demand driven. But this one, we know there are supply chain problems. For example, the railroad situation happening right now in the United States, if that were to go sideways and there was to be a railroad strike and kind of a slowdown of movement of goods on rail, that could lead to some really weird supply side problems in the macro economy that would probably lift up prices in the short term. But policy raising interest rates does not necessarily cure that. So the pandemic left the shadow effect of supply chain issues in China's zero COVID policy. They're trying to work that out and that has a lingering effect. And so if inflation is, let's say, 40% supply side and 60% demand side, rising interest rates will not necessarily cure that supply issue.
Oh my God.
So that's the conundrum that policymakers worldwide are dealing with. And that's why this inflation is so stubbornly high still, is because it still has the supply element. And economists have sort of now bought into the idea that it's not all demand this time. And that's what we talked about, the so-called transitory inflation originally. We figured that it's because the supply side will kind of work itself out. It hasn't yet.
Gosh, oh my gosh. I mean, it's almost kind of like, we had the supply issues coming out of the pandemic. It's almost like you're out of the frying pan and into the fire situation type of thing with the whole supply issue right now. So it's just, oh my goodness. Interesting times.
And what's even nastier about that, Mike, is the following: is that this, when you have supply side inflation, the tricky part about that is if you increase interest rates, knowing some of inflation generally is going to be demand driven. What you're doing is you're tipping the scales towards slower growth as a way of fighting the inflation. But if you can't fight all of it through higher interest rates, you have this sort of lingering specter of continued slower growth because the supply side of the economy will not relinquish that relatively high price level. So with higher rates and higher inflation, and I'm not saying we're going to have this, but that starts to creep in the specter of stagflation, where jobs are going to be lost due to higher interest rates and a slowdown in business investment at the same time that nasty inflation rate is not getting down to the point where consumers are thinking, wow, this is actually going to get cured. And then they slow down their demand. And then that starts to permeate a lot of different markets. So that's the game right now, is will the supply side kind of solve itself, and will higher interest rates exacerbate or solve the problem because it'll time itself well on the demand side? That's why so many central banks have been a little hesitant to start raising rates in earnest.
Right. Oh God. You've been doing this for a while. Have you ever seen a situation like this before? Because it's so unique what we're experiencing right now.
Not in my, let's say, professional lifetime, but there certainly have been times in which, if you look at the late 1970s and early 1980s, we had an episode where we had relatively high interest rates trying to fight relatively high inflation, primarily because we had a supply shock due to oil prices rising. Now, we've had oil prices rise this time, but we've had general supply side seizures that still have some aspects floating around globally. And it's very hard for me to actually use that time as a strong comparison to now, because there were so many different effects. And then the monetary policy experiments we kind of did into the Volcker era in late 1970s and early 1980s is not really what we're trying to do now. And are looked at as kind of, this is why you don't do monetary policy this way. Though they ultimately did cure the inflation problem, it's hard to know which one was more, because we had oil prices dropping simultaneously. But sorry, I'm lingering a little bit.
That's okay, no worries.
The point is that in my professional lifetime, no, but in, let's say, post-World War II era, the late 1970s, early 1980s is a somewhat similar time in terms of having sort of both sides kind of explaining why inflation is changing. But it tells you how hard it is when those things are changing simultaneously to solve the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember those when I was a wee little lad. I remember those days. And I remember the gas lines and,
Totally. You can only go on certain days of the week based on your license plate and all that craziness. Totally. I remember my mom being in a line too. So but I don't think we're going back to that. And we really are much better at central banking over the last 40 years as a result of that lesson that was learned. The key is whether or not we can have the global economy solve the supply side stuff. And of course, that's been exacerbated by a bunch of global issues, including what's happening with Ukraine and continuing on into the unforeseeable future. Yeah. That all that stuff is sort of unfortunately colluding to still exacerbate the supply side issues we saw with the pandemic.
Yeah.